The first thing she noticed was the smell. Not the antiseptic sting of the hospital where she'd spent her last conscious hours, tubes in both arms and a machine beeping her slow surrender. Not the particular sourness of her own unwashed skin after 3 weeks bedridden. This smell was wood smoke and horse dung, and something faintly floral, like cheap incense, burned in a room where people prayed for things they'd never receive. She opened her eyes. A ceiling of rough timber beams crossed above her, strung with dried bundles of herbs. A paper lantern, unlit. A crack in the plaster that spread like a river delta toward the far wall. Her name had been Park Jae-yeon. She had been 29 years old. She had been a data analyst for a mid-sized logistics company in Seoul, and she had spent her last 3 years reading web novels on her phone during her lunch breaks. And she had died of complications from a ruptured appendix because she'd been too busy finishing a chapter to notice the pain in her side until it was nearly too late. And then it was, in fact, too late. That much she remembered clearly. What she remembered equally clearly, and this was the part that made her sit up too fast and nearly crack her skull on the low bed frame, was the novel. The Flower of the Iron Fist. She had read all 847 available chapters. She had opinions about the protagonist, Seon D-ho, who was handsome and brooding, and had a tragic past and punched things with increasing efficiency for several hundred chapters. She had strong opinions about the main love interest, Lady Baek So-yeon, who was poised and cruel and delivered slaps the way other characters delivered speeches. She had extremely strong opinions about the world building, which was the sort of sprawling martial arts cultivation universe that existed primarily to give characters reasons to punch each other harder. And she was, unless she had entirely lost her mind, inside it. She was inside the Flower of the Iron Fist, in the body of Yeon Ha-rim, who was scheduled to die in Chapter 12. She sat very still on the edge of the unfamiliar bed and did the kind of calm, methodical inventory that her data analyst brain had always been good at. The room, a servant's quarters, small and spare. The body, female late teens by the feel of it, lean but not weak, hands calloused in a way the original Yeon Ha-rim would have had no reason to develop. Those calluses weren't Ha-rim's. Those were hers, or rather, they were the ghost of every isekai trope she'd ever consumed translated into actual physical reality. A body with latent potential that the previous owner had never bothered to unlock. She wiggled her fingers. They moved. She took a breath. It came. She pressed the heels of her palms against her eyes and sat with the pressure of it for a long, trembling moment. Then she got up and started taking stock of what she was working with. Yeon Ha-rim was a minor character. The novel spent approximately 3 paragraphs on her, a servant girl in the household of the Baek family, distant cousin to Lady Baek So-yeon through an illegitimate line, kept around as evidence of the family's magnanimity, and used primarily as a punching bag for So-yeon's moods. In Chapter 12, during the arrival of the male lead Seon D-ho at the Baek estate, Ha-rim would accidentally spill tea on So-yeon's robe. So-yeon would raise her hand to deliver a slap. D-ho would arrive just in time to watch, and So-yeon's cruelty would be established through this act as a character trait. Ha-rim would simply absorb it, fall to her knees, cry. Exist as a prop in someone else's story. Park Jae-yeon, data analyst, had read this scene with mild irritation and immediately forgotten it. Yeon Ha-rim, whoever she had been, had presumably not had the luxury of forgetting it. Jae-yeon stood at the small window of the servants' quarters and looked out at the Baek estate, all gray stone walls and manicured willows and the distant glint of a training ground, and made a decision. She was not going to absorb that slap. She was going to need a plan. The plan began with the body. She discovered it in increments over the first 3 days. The previous Ha-rim had been a cultivator in the way that a potted plant is a tree, technically the same species, but starved of everything that would let it grow. The cultivation pathways were there. The meridians, the channels through which chi was supposed to flow, all of it present, all of it narrowed to near nothing by years of malnourishment and overwork, and the particular kind of learned helplessness that comes from being small and overlooked and hit when you made noise. Jayon had never cultivated in her life. She had, however, read 847 chapters of a cultivation novel, and 231 chapters of a different cultivation novel, and several dozen fan translations of a third, and she had a data analyst's habit of extracting patterns from information sources she didn't fully understand. She knew the theory the way someone who has read every book about swimming knows the theory, comprehensively, and useless until tested. She tested it at 4 in the morning, when the estate was asleep, and the only witnesses were the moths clustering around the lantern she'd lit in the corner. She sat cross-legged on the cold floor and breathed. In the novel, this part was described in approximately one sentence. Harem cultivated in secret during the long nights of her servitude. The author had not been particularly interested in harem. The author had not been interested in the texture of sitting on cold stone until your tailbone went numb, or the specific frustration of reaching for something that should be there and finding nothing, or the way the moths kept bumping against the lantern shade and producing small, soft sounds like someone very gently tapping at a drum. She did it anyway, every night for 2 weeks. On the 15th night, something moved. It was the smallest thing imaginable, a warmth behind her sternum that wasn't quite warmth, more like the memory of warmth, like pressing your hand to a teacup that has been empty for 10 minutes. She chased it. She sat perfectly still on the cold floor and chased that ember trace of heat through pathways that had been closed her entire inherited life. And when the morning light came gray through the window, she had nothing to show for it but aching knees and a headache that pressed behind her eyes like a thumb. But she had felt it. That was enough. She kept going. The estate had its rhythms, and she learned them all. Lady Beek Soyeon rose late and exercised early, which meant the training ground was occupied from dawn until halfway through the morning. The male disciples of the household trained separately, closer to the outer wall. The kitchen servants began work 2 hours before dawn. The head housekeeper, a woman named Madame Choi, moved through the halls at unpredictable intervals and had eyes in the back of her head and an opinion about every surface that wasn't spotless. Jayon cleaned things, she carried water, she mended fabric, she listened. Listening was a skill that Jayon had developed in office meetings where nothing of importance was ever said directly, and she found it translated well. The servants talked. They talked the way people always talk when they believe they are invisible, freely, with the kind of specificity that only matters when you have nothing else. She learned that Lady Beek Soyeon's worst moods came 3 days before she was scheduled to compete in any tournament or demonstration. She learned that the family's second son, Beek Hyun-suk, was the one who actually maintained the training records and had a habit of leaving them in the archive room when he thought no one was looking. She learned the name of every guard rotation and what each man considered an adequate bribe to look elsewhere for 5 minutes. She filed all of it away, data, pattern, projection. At night she cultivated. The warmth behind her sternum grew, slowly then less slowly. By the end of the first month she could hold it steady for an hour, a small bright coal of focused chi that she'd coaxed into being through sheer stubbornness and an unreasonable amount of sitting on cold stone floors. It wasn't much. In the language of the novel, she was roughly at the point where a background character might exist, technically a cultivator, not powerful enough to matter. She intended to matter. She found the technique by accident. The archive room was unlocked on a Wednesday evening. She was learning the estate's calendar, which ran on a different system than anything she'd been trained on, but patterns were patterns, and she slipped inside to look at the training records, because she needed to understand the gap between what she was building quietly and what the family's trained disciples could do. Knowledge of your own deficiencies is only useful if you can quantify them. What she found instead, tucked behind a ledger that hadn't been opened in what looked like years, was a bound manuscript with a cover page in a handwriting she didn't recognize. The serpent's elbow, on the redirection of force through the secondary joints. She had to read it 3 times to understand what she was looking at. It was a technique manual. Old by the feel of the paper, the ink faded in places to near invisibility. It described a method of combat that didn't appear anywhere in the flower of the iron fist, which made sense because it was a servant's technique, developed specifically for people who had no chi to speak of and were likely to be attacked by people who did. It worked on the principle that superior force could be redirected rather than absorbed, that the joints could act as levers, that a blow aimed at the face could be turned with a motion so small it looked like flinching. Jaeyeon, who had never thrown a punch in her life and had now been building a quiet coal of chi for 31 days, sat on the archive room floor with the manuscript across her knees and felt something settle in her chest like a decision already made. She copied the entire thing by memory before putting it back exactly where she'd found it. The technique was designed for the secondary joints, elbow, knee, wrist, not the grand sweeping blocks of the main disciple's style, nothing that required overwhelming force or years of formal training. It worked through economy and angle, through the understanding that a hand raised to strike contains within it the geometry of its own defeat if you know where to touch it. She practiced on air. She practiced on the timber post in the corner of the servant's laundry yard at 2 in the morning, which left her forearms bruised in interesting ways that she explained to Madame Choi as falling down the stairs. She practiced the motion of it until it stopped being a motion and started being a reflex, the way anything becomes reflex if you do it enough times in the dark. It migrates from the thinking part of the brain to somewhere older, somewhere that responds before the thought completes. The elbow redirect, the wrist deflection, the subtle weight shift that meant the force of someone else's strike went past you instead of into you, spent on air. She also practiced, in the same 2 in the morning sessions, the thing that came after, because redirecting a blow only gets you so far. The serpent's elbow manual was very clear about this. Redirection without response is merely delay. The servant who survives a single strike and does not follow it will receive 10 more. She was not going to receive 10 more. 4 days before Chapter 12, she felt the estate change. Not visibly. The walls were the same gray stone. The willows moved the same way in the same morning wind. But the servant's conversation shifted in register, a half-tone higher, more careful, more clipped. The training ground was used later into the evening. Madame Choi inspected the guest quarters twice in one afternoon. Someone important was coming. Jaeyeon knew who. She had known for 6 weeks. She had been counting down since the first morning she'd woken up in this body, and understood where she was and what was coming. She had spent 6 weeks building something small and specific and ready, and now she stood in the kitchen garden pulling herbs because it was her task for the morning, and the feeling in her chest was not quite fear and not quite anticipation, but something between them, the way you feel before an exam you've studied very hard for, knowing the preparation was real, not knowing if it was enough. The male lead arrived on a gray afternoon. She saw him from a distance, across the estate's main courtyard. Seon Di-ho, tall and dark-haired and wearing the expression the author always described as brooding, and which mostly looked, from this distance, like the expression of someone who was slightly cold and didn't want to complain about it. He was impressive. She could feel why people found him impressive, the way you can sometimes feel a magnet through a surface without touching it. She felt nothing particularly romantic about it. She had work to do. The incident happened on the 3rd morning. Jaeyeon knew it was coming the way you know an alarm is about to go off. Not the sound yet, but the quality of the silence before it. She was serving tea in the receiving room where Lady Beek So-yeon was demonstrating her calligraphy to a group of visiting women disciples, which was an activity that required complete quiet and significant peripheral observation from the servants, and Jae-yeon was carrying a tray with a full teapot and 4 cups. She felt the small shift in her own feet before she consciously registered the corner of the mat. In the original novel, this is where harem trips, where the tea goes on So-yeon's robe, where So-yeon rises from her seat with the particular slowness of someone who has all the time in the world to be furious. Jae-yeon did not trip. She caught herself. A small adjustment, weight redistributed, tray steady, tea unspilled. There was a moment where she thought, maybe this is enough. Maybe the smallest change rewrites the whole scene. Then she looked up and found Lady Beek So-yeon watching her with the flat, dark attention of a cat who has just decided something. "You hesitated," So-yeon said. The room went very still. "My lady, in your step, you hesitated." So-yeon set down her brush with the kind of careful deliberateness that is its own form of violence. A servant who is uncertain in their own step is a servant who is uncertain in everything. Jae-yeon stood very still with the tea tray and waited. "You've been quiet these past weeks," So-yeon continued. She rose from her seat. She moved through the room the way water moves, the way the novel had always described her moving, like everything in the space was arranged for her convenience and would rearrange itself further if required. "The other servants have noticed. They think you've become obedient," she smiled. "I don't think that's it at all." So-yeon stopped in front of her. Jae-yeon looked straight ahead, past So-yeon's shoulder at the wall. "Look at me." She looked. Lady Beek So-yeon was beautiful in the way that the novel's author had spent considerable time describing. Classical features, skin like paper, eyes that held a permanent edge of amusement at everyone else's expense. She was also, Jae-yeon noted, with the detached part of her brain that was still taking data, afraid of something. There was a tension around her eyes that hadn't been there a week ago, and the fact that she was picking this particular fight in front of witnesses, rather than in a hallway somewhere, was the behavior of someone who needed to perform certainty because they were not certain. Seon Di-ho was in the estate. The plot was moving. So-yeon was shoring up her authority the only way she knew how. Jae-yeon kept her face still and her hands on the tray and breathed. "You've been looking at people differently," So-yeon said. Her hand rose, slowly, demonstratively, in a way that had already informed the watching women that this was intentional and meant. "I dislike being looked at differently by servants." The hand arced toward Jae-yeon's face. This was the moment. In the original novel, Harem took it, absorbed it, fell to her knees and wept and proved So-yeon's authority to the room and to the arriving hero and faded back into the background of someone else's story. Jae-yeon's elbow moved. It was a small motion, almost nothing, the kind of thing that could be mistaken for a flinch, for a twitch, for the involuntary movement of a startled body. The inside of her forearm caught the underside of So-yeon's wrist at the specific angle she had practiced in the dark for 6 weeks, and the redirected force of the slap went past Jae-yeon's cheekbone and expended itself on air. So-yeon's own momentum carried her hand a few inches further than she'd intended. The room made a sound that was not quite a gasp. Jae-yeon had not dropped the tea tray. Her hands had not moved from their position at the tray's handles. She stood exactly as she had been standing, except that So-yeon's hand was now slightly past her head and So-yeon's face, for the first time in the 3 paragraphs the original novel had ever given her, was expressing something that was not amusement or authority. It was surprise. Jae-yeon had exactly 3 seconds before that surprise curdled into fury. She used one of them to set the tray carefully on the nearest available surface. She used another to step back, 2 paces, enough distance to be clearly intentional. She used the third to find So-yeon's eyes, and she let So-yeon see briefly what she was actually looking at. Not the girl from chapter 12. Someone who had been studying her for 6 weeks and would be studying her for as long as the novel required it. "I apologize, my lady," Jayon said, and the words were entirely correct. The inflection of them was entirely correct, and under the inflection was something else that So-yeon would hear and no one else in the room would be able to name. "I startled." The silence stretched. The door of the receiving room opened. Seon Di-ho had a particular way of arriving in scenes. The novel had always described him entering spaces at precisely the moment that information was needed, like a function called by the narrative. He stood in the doorway now with 2 disciples at his back, and took in the room with the unhurried attention of someone whose particular skill set was assessment. His gaze moved from So-yeon's expression to Jaehyun's position to the tray on the table. Jaehyun looked back at him for exactly 1 beat. Then she picked up the tray, performed the correct curtsy for mixed company, and carried the tea out of the room. She was scrubbing pots in the kitchen when the kitchen girl hand told her that Lady Baek So-yeon had retired with a headache and would not be receiving further calligraphy visitors that afternoon. Jaehyun scrubbed pots. "Also," Han said, with the particular quietness of someone who had decided to say something and wasn't sure if they should, "the visiting disciples are saying that the Seon young master watched you leave." Jaehyun applied more pressure to a stubborn scorch mark. "Did he?" Han-soo said he asked who you were. Han was watching her the way the younger servants sometimes watched her now, with the cautious interest of someone who has seen an animal they thought they understood do something unexpected. Madam Choi told him you were just a household servant. He said he understood, but Han-soo said he looked back at the door. "Han-soo talks a great deal," Jaehyun said. "Yes," Han agreed, "that's how we know things." Jaehyun finished the pot and set it aside and picked up the next one. Her hands were steady. The warm coal in her chest was steady. Outside the kitchen window the estate was doing what estates do, continuing, indifferent to the small seismic event that had just occurred in its receiving room. Chapter 12 had been rewritten. She didn't know what Chapter 13 looked like now. The novel she had read no longer applied as a script. The plot had been carrying Yeon Harim toward a specific kind of erasure, and she had declined to cooperate, and now the story was doing what stories do when you interrupt them. It was improvising. She found she wasn't afraid of that. She found, turning a blackened pot in hands that had been calloused by practice and hard work and deliberate preparation, that she was something closer to curious. The days after had a different texture. So-yeon did not come for her directly. This was, Jaehyun suspected, because a direct confrontation would require acknowledging that there had been something to confront, and So-yeon was too skilled a political creature to create documentation of her own unsettled authority. Instead, there were small pressures. Jaehyun reassigned from interior serving duties to the outer garden work. Jaehyun's food ration slightly reduced in a way that Madam Choi would deny if asked. Jaehyun's sleeping hours interrupted by tasks that materialized at inconvenient times. Jaehyun did the tasks, she did the garden work. She ate the reduced ration without complaint and supplemented it with the small stores she'd been quietly accumulating for exactly this eventuality. Because she'd known this was coming. Because she'd read 847 chapters of this novel and understood how its primary antagonist operated. She cultivated every night on less sleep and found, to her genuine surprise, that the reduced ration actually helped. Or rather, it helped because it had made her angry in the specific, clean way that good fuel makes a clean fire, and she'd been using that anger the way she'd used the cold floor, as a surface to push against. The warm coal had become a small, steady flame. She started working through the second level of the serpent's elbow. She met Seon Di-ho properly on a Tuesday. She was carrying water from the outer well to the garden, which was the kind of task that in a different novel would be set up for a romantic encounter, and in this one felt primarily like an opportunity for her traps to get stronger. Di-ho was walking the perimeter of the estate with one of the family's elder disciples, which was apparently something he did in the mornings between formal cultivation sessions. He fell into step beside her as the elder disciple continued ahead. Jae-yeon adjusted her grip on the water yoke and kept walking. "You're Yeon Harim," he said. "Yes, young master." "You're the one from the receiving room." "Yes, young master." He was quiet for a few steps. Then, what was that? She glanced at him sideways. He was looking at her with the focused attention she'd noticed from across the courtyard, the particular quality of regard that the novel had never adequately explained, and that in person felt like being very precisely measured. "My lady's hand came close," Jae-yeon said carefully. "I moved." "You moved before her hand was close." This was true, and she had nothing useful to say about it. "I startled," she said again. That's what you told her. He had a very flat affect for someone supposedly burning with tragic inner fire. The novel had romanticized this quality considerably. In person, he mostly seemed like someone who had stopped wasting energy on social performance sometime in his early adolescence and hadn't started again. It was a training response. She said nothing. "You've been training," he said, "not a question." "I maintain my assigned tasks to the best of my ability, young master." He stopped walking. She kept walking for 2 more steps, then had to stop as well because continuing would be its own kind of statement. "The Beek family," Di-ho said, "does not permit their servants to cultivate." "I'm aware of that, young master." "Are you cultivating?" There was a long pause. The water yoke was heavy. She shifted it slightly, redistributing weight, and felt the flame in her chest do the small patient thing it did now when she focused on it. Just present, just burning, available. "I wouldn't presume to cultivate without permission," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer. His expression was very difficult to read, which was a quality she appreciated in people even when it was inconvenient. "Be careful," he said finally, and walked back to the path. Jae-yeon carried the water to the garden. She set it down and stood for a moment in the pale morning light, breathing, listening to the distant sound of the training ground. She thought about what it meant that the male lead of this novel had just told her to be careful. She thought about what the original harem had been to this story. A momentary prop, a proof of cruelty, a pair of knees hitting the floor. She thought about the flame in her chest, and the technique in her hands, and the 6 weeks of practice in the dark that had rewritten one scene. She filled the garden cisterns and went back to work. The tournament announcement came in the 2nd week of Di-ho's visit. This was not in chapter 12 or 13. This was further into the novel, chapter 30-something. She was running ahead of the original timeline, which meant the story had shifted under her feet like a river changing course. The Beek family was hosting a skills demonstration for the visiting faction leaders who had arrived with Di-ho, a display of the household's cultivation talent. All disciples were invited to participate. Servants were not invited to participate. But participation lists, she had learned, were maintained in the archive room. And the archive room was unlocked on Wednesdays. She stared at the participation list for a long time. Added one name at the bottom in the same administrative hand that had signed the servants' quarterly records, which she had been watching Madame Choi produce for 3 weeks and could now approximate well enough. She put the list back, smoothed the edge of the paper where her hand had pressed, left the archive room exactly as she'd found it. Went back to scrubbing the flagstones. The morning of the demonstration, she woke 2 hours before dawn and sat with the flame. It was not small anymore. She had been careful about this, careful not to let it show, not to let the cultivation pressure bleed out of her in ways that the senior disciples would sense. In the language of the novel, she was at a level that should have been impossible for someone who had started 6 weeks ago, which she attributed to 2 things: the latent pathways that had been waiting in this body for years, and the specific, unglamorous, methodical stubbornness that had always been her actual strongest trait. She breathed. She fed the flame carefully from the cultivation she'd built in the dark. She thought about the serpent's elbow and the redirected force, and the 2 seconds in the receiving room when So-yeon's hand had passed her face. Then she got up, dressed in the plain uniform she'd set aside the night before, and went to the demonstration ground. The trouble started before she got there. She was halfway across the outer courtyard when she found Lady Beak So-yeon waiting for her, which told her immediately that So-yeon had either seen the list or had watchers who had. So-yeon was alone, which was unusual and deliberate, and the expression on her face was the one the novel had always reserved for her most focused cruelties. "Where are you going?" Jae-yeon stopped. "To the demonstration ground, my lady." "Servants don't participate in demonstrations." "I was under the impression there was an open invitation, my lady." So-yeon stepped forward. The morning was cold and very still. "Let me be direct with you," she said, with a kind of exhausted precision that Jae-yeon recognized as the voice of someone who has maintained their authority through force of personality for a long time and is tired of it. "I don't know what you are. You are not what you were. Something has changed in you in the past weeks, and I don't understand it, and things I don't understand concern me." She paused. "Whatever you've been doing, it ends now. You will return to the kitchen. You will do your work. You will not attend the demonstration." Jae-yeon looked at her. Not with defiance. Defiance was loud, performative, the kind of thing that escalated situations. She looked at her with the same quality of attention she'd been using for 6 weeks, observing, cataloging, understanding the shape of the problem in front of her. So-yeon was not cruel because she was evil. The novel had framed her as the antagonist, the foil, the obstacle between the protagonist and his growth arc, but Jae-yeon had spent 6 weeks watching her, and she understood something the author had apparently not thought to explore. So-yeon was cruel because she was afraid. She was the daughter of a great family in a world where daughters of great families had very few forms of power available to them, and she had taken the ones she'd been given and honed them to razor sharpness, because the alternative was to have no power at all. This was not a reason to accept a slap, but it was a reason to be precise about what you were fighting and why. "My lady," Jae-yeon said, "I'm not your enemy." So-yeon's eyes narrowed. "I'm not competing with you. I'm not going to embarrass the family. I'm going to walk into that demonstration and do what I can do, and what I can do is not enough to threaten anyone in that room who matters to you, but I am going to walk in." She kept her voice very level. "If you want to stop me, you're going to have to do it in front of witnesses in the courtyard, 20 minutes before the faction leaders arrive for the demonstration that your family is hosting." A long silence. The demonstration ground was visible from here, the banners going up in the early light. "You've thought about this very carefully," So-yeon said. "I've had a lot of time to think." Another silence. So-yeon looked at her with an expression that was still difficult to read, but that had, underneath it, the quality of someone revising a calculation. "If you embarrass this family," she said finally, "I will make every remaining day of your life in this house into something you will not forget." "I understand." So-yeon stepped aside. Jae-yeon walked to the demonstration ground. She drew her lot in the second round. The opponent was a junior disciple named Wei Ju-han, who was 17 and had been cultivating formally for 4 years, and who, Jae-yeon knew from 6 weeks of listening to servant gossip, had a temper and an overcommitted right-side attack. She stood on the demonstration mat in her plain uniform among the embroidered jackets of the formal disciples, and felt the eyes of the assembled faction leaders and family members settle on her like a weight. She felt Seon Di-ho's attention from the observer's gallery as a slightly different weight, more focused, more patient. She felt So-yeon watching from the eastern archway. Wei Juhan looked at her with the expression of someone who has been handed an insult and is deciding how loudly to laugh at it. "Servant," he said, not to her but to the matchkeeper. "The list was confirmed this morning," the matchkeeper said unhappily. Wei shrugged and took his stance. It was an excellent stance, textbook, the kind of thing that 4 years of formal training produced. Strong foundation, right side slightly forward, arms at the precise angles the beak school prescribed. He looked like someone who had won a lot of matches this way. Jia took her own stance, which did not look like anything in particular, which was the point. He came at her hard and fast, right side leading exactly as she'd expected, with the committed overextension of someone who had never needed to account for opponents who moved in the specific ways she had spent 6 weeks practicing. She moved. The elbow redirect, the specific angle. His force expended itself past her, and she was already inside his guard, the second motion of the serpent's elbow flowing from the first the way she drilled it in the dark. A palm strike to the side of his right shoulder that leveraged his own overextension and turned it into momentum that carried him past her entirely. He stumbled, didn't fall, spun. The watching crowd made a sound. He came again, faster this time. Less committed, he'd adjusted, which told her he was better than his temper suggested, and she felt a flicker of genuine respect for that even as she read his adjustment and responded to it. The third technique from the serpent's elbow, a deflection that caught his second strike at the wrist and redirected it downward. And then she stepped past him and put a very precise, very controlled pressure on the back of his knee that caused him to go down. He went down to one knee, not hard, not humiliating, just down. The matchkeeper counted. Wei Juhan looked up at her from his knee with an expression she recognized. The same expression she'd seen briefly on So-Yeon's face in the receiving room. Not rage, not contempt, something rarer and more useful. He was trying to figure out what she'd done. "Match," the matchkeeper called. The silence afterward was the best kind of silence, the kind that means everyone in the room is recalculating. Jia bowed to her opponent, which was the correct form which she had practiced, and walked off the mat. She didn't win the demonstration. She hadn't expected to. She won 3 matches and lost the 4th, which was against a senior disciple who was simply better than she was and also not susceptible to the overextension that the serpent's elbow was designed to exploit. She lost cleanly, with the technique still intact even in defeat. A controlled loss, a studied loss, one that told the watchers something different than a rout would have told them. She walked off the mat at the end with her hands still steady, and her breath only slightly elevated. Xian Diho was waiting outside the demonstration ground. This was not a narrative convenience. This was a person who had finished his own observation of the demonstration and had then stood somewhere specific because he had something to say. "The serpent's elbow," he said, "that's what you've been training." She looked at him. "It's a servant's technique," he said. "Old, not in any of the main school's syllabuses." He paused. "Where did you find it?" "I found a manuscript," she said carefully, "in the archive." "The archive is restricted." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. In the distance, she could hear the demonstration ground resuming its ordinary chaos, the chatter of spectators, the sound of the next match beginning. "Who taught you?" he said. "No one, I taught myself." The flat affect did something complicated. She had come to understand, in the weeks of watching him move through the estate, that his face's stillness wasn't absence of expression, but control of it. The same thing she was doing, but with more practice and a different history of reasons. "You taught yourself a cultivator's technique," he said, "in 6 weeks with no formal instruction, starting from scratch, while performing full servant duties." "Yes." "And you went into the demonstration ground today knowing you would not win it, because winning it was not the objective." She waited. "What was the objective?" Jae-yoon thought about this. She thought about it honestly, in the way she tried to think about things that mattered. To exist in a way that makes it harder to erase me, she said finally. He looked at her for a long time. There's an outer disciples training session tomorrow morning, he said. Dawn, the west courtyard. He turned to go, stopped, turned back. The Beek family's formal restrictions on servant cultivation are a household rule, not a law. If someone were to register as a provisional outer disciple rather than a household servant, those restrictions wouldn't apply. He walked away. Jae-yoon stood in the quiet aftermath of the demonstration, ground and breathed, and the flame in her chest did what it had been doing for 6 weeks, burning. She registered that afternoon. The forms were in the administrative block, which was not particularly restricted because no one had apparently imagined this situation needing to be prevented. Madam Choi found her filling out the provisional outer disciple registration with the particular expression of someone who has been maintaining a complex internal argument for some time and has just reached a conclusion. "You're leaving the household staff," Madam Choi said. "I'm expanding my duties." Madam Choi looked at the form, looked at Jae-yoon. The expression shifted into something that was still not warm exactly, but was no longer entirely impersonal. "You scrubbed the flagstones better than anyone I've had in 5 years, she said, which was not a compliment and was not a compliment. "Don't make me have to say I regret this." "I won't," Jae-yoon said. Madam Choi walked away without confirming or denying whatever she decided. Jae-yoon filed the registration. She moved her practice to the west courtyard at dawn, which was where she saw Lady Beek So-yeon for the first time since the courtyard confrontation, because So-yeon also trained at dawn, something Jae-yoon had known and had accounted for. They moved on the same ground at the same hour in opposite corners of the courtyard for 3 days without speaking. On the 4th day, So-yeon came and stood at the edge of Jae-yoon's practice space and watched. Jae-yoon finished the form she was running and came to rest. "The second joint control," So-yeon said. "In the serpent's elbow, you're using it wrong." Jae-yoon looked at her. "The wrist position in the redirect." So-yeon demonstrated it in the air without touching her, a precise articulation of the joint that Jae-yoon had been getting within approximately 80% of correct. "Like that, not the way you're doing it. You're losing efficiency and creating an opening on your left." A silence. "How do you know the serpent's elbow?" Jae-yoon said. So-yeon's expression was very controlled. "My grandmother was 3rd daughter of a minor family," she said. "She learned it before she married into this house." She lowered her hand. It was considered a disreputable technique. Jae-yoon thought about what it had cost So-yeon to say that, thought about what it meant that she had. She adjusted her wrist position and ran the redirect again. "Better," So-yeon said, and walked back to her corner of the courtyard. There was a test she hadn't anticipated. 3 days after she registered as an outer disciple, one of the senior disciples, a man named Kang Byul-ha, broad-shouldered and 23 years old and apparently very interested in establishing the correct social order, came to find her during her morning practice. He had 2 of his training partners with him. They stood at the edge of the west courtyard and watched her run the serpent's elbow forms and said nothing until she finished. And then Kang Byul-ha walked onto the practice space without invitation. "Outer disciple registration," he said. "There's a fee." Jae-yoon looked at him. "I'm not aware of a fee." "New policy for servants who register," he smiled. "You pay it to me." She looked at the 2 men flanking him, both of whom had the loose, comfortable posture of people who expected this to resolve very quickly and very much in their favor. "What does the fee consist of?" she said. "You leave, you go back to the kitchen. You forget the registration and the demonstration and whatever you've been doing at dawn, and you go back to being nothing, which is what you were and what you should still be." Jae-yoon said nothing for a moment. That's not a fee, she said finally. That's a request. Kang Byul-ha's smile stayed exactly where it was, which was the smile of someone who had never needed to maintain a smile under pressure, because the pressure always moved in the other direction. It's a request that has the same weight as a fee, he said, the difference being that a fee can be negotiated and this cannot. The two men shifted forward slightly, not threateningly, not yet, just present in the way that size makes itself present before it needs to be used. Jaeyeon thought about this with the part of her brain that had spent 6 weeks mapping the estate's power structures. She thought about Kang Byul-ha's actual cultivation level, which she'd observed in the demonstration and in morning practices. Legitimate, formal years of training that she couldn't match directly. She thought about the serpent's elbow and what it was designed for, which was not formal duels against prepared opponents. She thought about witnesses. There were none. The west courtyard at this hour, the disciples who had observed the demonstration had their own training assignments now. The servants were in the kitchen. Di-ho was in a meeting with the family elders that she knew from the schedule she'd memorized. I understand, she said. Kang Byul-ha's smile relaxed into satisfaction, which was the expression of someone who has resolved a problem. I thought you might. I understand, Jaeyeon said, that you need me to leave because I embarrassed Wei Juhan in front of the faction leaders, and Wei Juhan is your training partner, and that embarrassment reflected on you by association. She kept her voice very even, very neutral, very much the voice of someone relaying observed data. And I understand that the easiest way to resolve that is to remove me before I do anything else you can't predict. The satisfaction left Kang Byul-ha's face. But I'm not going to leave, she said. And I want you to know why, so that what happens next is a choice you make with full information. What happens next, he said, is that my colleagues assist you in understanding the situation. What happens next, Jaeyeon said, is that Seon Di-ho will hear about this by this evening. He may already be tracking what happens in this courtyard. I don't know his habits well enough to be certain. But he spoke to me specifically after the demonstration. He gave me information I needed to register. That means he has an interest in this space and an interest in what happens in it. She watched Kang Byul-ha process this. Additionally, she said, Lady Baek So-yeon has been correcting my form in this courtyard for 3 mornings. I don't know what that means for her relationship to me, but I know it means she has noticed me in a different register than before, and she is not someone who invests attention she doesn't intend to protect. The two men behind Kang Byul-ha exchanged a glance. You're bluffing, Kang said. I might be, Jaeyeon said agreeably. But you need to decide whether I am, right now in the next few seconds, before this goes any further, and the cost of being wrong is considerably higher than the cost of leaving. A long silence. The morning birds were starting. The distant training ground was producing its first sounds of the day. Somewhere in the estate a bell rang twice, which was the signal for the second kitchen service. Kang Byul-ha looked at her for a moment that she didn't bother tracking. She was watching his hands, his weight distribution, the angle of his shoulders, and then he turned and walked out of the courtyard. His two partners followed. Jaeyeon stood in the empty courtyard and breathed. Then she went back to running forms. She had not been entirely honest. She didn't know whether Di-ho was tracking this space. She didn't know the full dimension of So-yeon's new interest in her or what it would mean if tested. She had staked those claims on observation and probability, on what she'd seen and extrapolated, and she wouldn't know if the extrapolation was correct until something tested it. But Kang Byul-ha had left. Data pattern projection outcome. She filed it away and kept working. The nature of the training changed when So-yeon started correcting her. It was never announced as a teaching relationship. So-yeon did not say, I will teach you. She said on the 4th morning without preamble while Jaeyeon was running the 3rd form of the serpent's elbow, your left shoulder drops in the transition. Here. and demonstrated. Jayon adjusted. Again. She ran it again. Your grandmother's technique, Jayon said quietly, after the third correction had resolved the shoulder issue. She must have been good. Soyeon was quiet for a moment. She was third daughter, she said. Her family had no resources to give her a formal cultivation education. She developed what she could with what she had. A pause. She died before I was born. But she left notes. Notes, Jayon said. In the archive room, Soyeon said, and her eyes cut to Jayon with the precision of a blade, behind a ledger that hadn't been opened in years. Jayon kept her face very still. You read faster than I expected, Soyeon said. I had been intending to leave those notes accessible for a specific purpose and for a specific person, and you were not that person, and yet. She turned back to her own forms, running them with the effortless precision of someone who had been formally trained since childhood. It produced an interesting result, so I have decided to be pragmatic about it. Jayon turned this over carefully. You left the archive unlocked. The archive, Soyeon said, is unlocked on Wednesdays. A beat. You left the notes accessible on Wednesdays. My grandmother's technique deserves to be used by someone who will use it well, Soyeon said. It has been sitting in that archive for 18 years doing nothing. My position in this household has never permitted me to practice it openly. A pause that had something in it that was too controlled to be called grief, but had grief's shape. I had been waiting for the correct opportunity. You created a different opportunity than the one I anticipated. Jayon thought about 6 weeks of cold floors and dark practice, and the stubborn accumulation of a flame that shouldn't have been possible. Thought about what it meant that it had only been possible because the archive room was unlocked on Wednesdays. Why me, she said. You could have left those notes accessible for any servant. Most servants, Soyeon said, would have read them and done nothing, or would have tried to use the technique and failed because the serpent's elbow requires a particular quality of mind. It is not a powerful technique. It is a precise one. It rewards people who are methodical and patient and willing to do a great deal of work for a very small visible result. She ran a transition between forms without looking at Jayon. I had been watching you for 3 months before you woke up. Jayon had been in this body for 6 weeks. She was quiet for a long moment. The previous harem, she said carefully. Was nothing, Soyeon said, with the directness of someone who has long since stopped pretending otherwise. I am aware that makes me sound like a monster. I watched her for 3 months and she was nothing. She was exactly what this household expected her to be, which was invisible and absorbent. She would have taken the slap in the receiving room. She would have cried. She would have continued to be nothing. A pause. And then something changed, and you are not nothing. And I don't know what changed or what you are, but the notes are gone from the archive and you are using them well. So I have decided that the how is less important than the result. Jayon looked at the courtyard wall, at the gray stone with its lichen and its cracks, at the banners of the Beek household hanging still in the morning air. What was the specific opportunity you were waiting for? She said. Soyeon's forms came to rest. She turned to look at Jayon directly for the first time in this conversation. My grandmother's name was Yon Hwaran, she said. She was third daughter of a minor family. Her family name was Yon. Jayon's heart did something very quiet and very large. Harem's family name, she said. The same family, distant, 2 generations removed. Soyeon's face was utterly composed, and underneath the composure something that had been held for a long time was being held still through considerable effort. My grandmother wrote in her notes that she hoped the technique would someday return to her family's line, that it would find someone in that line who deserved it. She paused. I was keeping the archive unlocked for that someone. I had identified Harem as a possible inheritor, though I had my doubts. Jayon stood in the morning light and breathed. She was Park Jayon, data analyst, dead at 29. She was Yon Harim, minor character, scheduled for erasure. She was in a story written by someone who had not thought to make her matter. She was also, apparently, the distant descendant of the woman who had created the technique she had spent 6 weeks teaching herself in the dark. "I don't know if I'm the person your grandmother was hoping for," she said honestly. "No," So-Yon agreed, "but you deflected my hand in front of witnesses and didn't drop the tray. That is considerably more than Harim would have done." The composure had settled back fully, the grief, or whatever it was, sealed away again into the precise, contained person the world was permitted to see. "So, your left shoulder drops. Again." Jayon ran the form again. This time, So-Yon said nothing. The shoulder was correct. This is not the end of the story. This is barely the beginning. The story that the novel told about Seon Di-ho and his tragic past, and his ascending cultivation rank in the great tournament that would define his arc, was still happening, somewhere in the territory ahead. The faction politics were still in motion. The villain who had murdered Di-ho's family was still operating, still planning whatever the novel's next 50 chapters had planned for him. But Yon Harim was no longer a footnote in that story. She was a provisional outer disciple who had built a cultivation flame from nothing in 6 weeks. She was the only person in the estate who had used the serpent's elbow in a sanctioned demonstration in living memory. She was the person who had made Lady Baek So-Yon's hand pass empty air in a receiving room full of witnesses, and had set down a tray of tea afterward without spilling a drop. She was the person Seon Di-ho had stopped to speak to in an outer courtyard, in the specific way that people stop to speak to someone they intend to speak to again. She was Park Jae-yeon, who had died of appendicitis because she'd been too busy reading a chapter to notice the pain in her side, and who had woken up inside that chapter, and who had decided, not in a grand speech, not in a moment of cinematic epiphany, but in the quiet and deliberate way she had always decided things, that if she was going to be in a story, she was going to be in it on her own terms. Every morning she woke before dawn. She sat with the flame until it answered her. Then she got up and went to work. This was not the elegant method. It was not the technique of a naturally gifted martial artist, or the trajectory of a protagonist who had been chosen by fate, or the story of someone whose potential had always been obvious. It was the method of a person who had been invisible for a very long time and had decided, with the particular determination of the consistently underestimated, that she was done cooperating with that arrangement. The story would change around her. The plot would adjust. The novel she had read would become increasingly unrecognizable, and she would keep moving through it anyway, with calloused hands and a steady flame, and the serpent's elbow refined now to the level where even So-Yon's sharp eyes couldn't find the inefficiency. There would be a night, 3 weeks from now, when Seon Di-ho would come to find her in the outer disciple's dormitory with a look on his face that she had learned to read as the expression of a person choosing, very carefully, what to say next. He would sit across from her in the study room with a lamp between them, and tell her that the faction his enemies had sent to the Baek estate was not a courtesy visit, that the intelligence he'd gathered before arriving had been compromised, that someone in the estate was feeding information outward, and the faction was preparing a move against the family that would come in the form of a formal challenge during the extended tournament season. A challenge that, if accepted and lost, would strip the Baek family of its allied territories and leave it isolated, and if refused would mark it as unable to defend its own honor. He would tell her this not because she was the protagonist of his story, not because the narrative had identified her as his ally or his partner, or the woman who would eventually stand beside him in whatever grand final confrontation the original novel had been building toward. He would tell her because he had been watching her since the receiving room and had concluded, in the flat-affect methodical way he processed everything, that she was the most useful person in this estate. She would appreciate that. She would appreciate it considerably more than whatever the novel had planned for her. She would tell him what she had: 6 weeks of servants' observation, a complete mental map of every guard rotation and kitchen schedule and meeting room, the names of 12 people in the estate who had reasons to need money and 3 of them who had recently spent money they shouldn't have had. She would lay it out the way she had always laid out a data problem, structured and specific and stripped of the dramatic framing that novels always added to this kind of scene. He would listen to all of it without speaking. When she finished, he would say, "You've been running an intelligence operation." "I've been paying attention," she would say. "I had reasons to." And now, she would think about the flame in her chest, and the calluses on her hands and the serpent's elbow and the form she'd run that morning, until So-Yeon found nothing left to correct. "And now I have more reasons," she would say. She would not know, sitting in that study room with a lamp between them, how the rest of the story went. She had lost the script. The 847 chapters she'd read were increasingly useless, the timeline bent beyond recognition from the moment her elbow had moved in the receiving room and a cup of tea had remained unspilled. She found she was not afraid of that either. She had learned in 6 weeks of working from nothing towards something in the dark that the script was never really the point. The point was the work. The point was the next form, the next correction, the next morning before dawn when you sat with your flame and asked it to burn a little steadier, and it did, because you had asked it every morning for long enough that the asking and the answering had become the same motion. There would be a tournament. There would be factions and politics, and the cultivator's world doing what the cultivator's world always did, which was escalate its conflicts until someone extraordinary intervened. She did not know yet if she would be that extraordinary. But she would be there, and her elbow would be faster. She was going to make absolutely certain of that. She was not the chosen one. She was something older and more stubborn than that. She was the person who showed up every morning and did the work, and the work was starting, finally, to show. The elbow was faster. It was always going to be faster. She had made it so.